If you were to ask me what one of the standout models for 40k are, Knights would definitely be well up there, regardless of that price tag. A while ago, I hit 10k on Instagram, so I decided to actually give one away. I was hoping that the person would want it painted, but I kind of gave the option to have it painted or new in box. The person that it went to was a painter as well, so of course they wanted to paint it for themselves, which is fine. So I ended up just buying another one because I really wanted to make a video with one. Now the process of building the model and creating the base are going to be separated into a second video that I'm going to upload 1 or 2 days after this one, purely because that was quite intensive in of itself. So in this video, we're just going to be sticking to actually painting the miniature. And with that said, I'm going to give this one away as well. I'm going to give this knight away to one of my Patreon supporters. Patreon is essentially what's going to help me keep doing projects like this in the future. I'm just going to keep creating videos, but with the support of you guys, I can justify giving them away. So if you want to support me, as well as have a chance to actually own this very miniature yourself, please go check that out in the description. And on top of that, I'm going to call it out before anyone else does, because this knight is also very similar to one that you may have seen on YouTube before. Pete the Wargamer did one. He converted a Lancer, and this Cerastus Knight's scheme and base are both heavily inspired by his, purely because I absolutely fell in love with that one. So if you want to see a very different take on a similar kind of model and scheme, go check out that video because it's dope. I started out this project by priming with an airbrush using Pro Acryl's black. Now I'm going to preface this by saying I'm recording this audio a fair while after actually painting this. I don't off the top of my head remember what all of the colors that I used are. So I'm going to create a list and just put them in the description of the video. I do know, however, that I will have base coated it with Games Workshop's Rhinox Hide through an airbrush, and this will kind of be the underlying layer, because after this I'm going to cover it in some AK Interactive heavy chipping fluid. This is sprayed through an airbrush, left to dry for an hour, and then the subsequent layers are painted over it. The way this fluid works is essentially you can paint over it, but once that paint on top has dried, and I wouldn't leave it dry for any more than 2 to 3 hours, you can then reactivate it, so kind of moisten the top layer of paint. Obviously that's going to seep through somewhat to the chipping fluid, and it's going to soften up that chipping fluid and allow you to use whatever tool or implement you'd like to peel away little bits of paint. So sometimes I'll just use a more stiff old brush, sometimes I'll use a toothpick or a little pin. After laying down the first base coat from Vellejo's Panzer Ace's green range, I then go over it with another green. Again, I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it's Vellejo model color olive green, but it'll all be in the description below. And just making sure to cover less area than the previous layer, so kind of creating a natural shadow. I've then taken some white ink. I specifically like to use ink just so as it splatters a bit less, goes through the airbrush a bit smoother, and then added that top highlight. I then started spraying my second color. So this is Games Workshop's Karak Stone, and then Vellejo Bone White, and then just a little bit of white ink over the top of that. I then mixed together some Games Workshop Agrax EarthShade and Carabao Crimson, so the red wash, to create a 50-50 reddish brown ink essentially, and sprayed that in multiple thin passes into all of the shadows, just to reinforce the shadows, but also introduce a little bit more color variation in the model. So you can see it's much more prominent on the white, and I think it's a really nice effect. I've then wet the entire miniature after leaving that to dry for about an hour, and you can see just using an old crappy brush, I'm just kind of aggressively rubbing it and pulling away some paint to create a nice chipping effect. I then just use a little baby wipe to dab up some of the excess moisture. And once that water is dried, I won't actually varnish it yet. I'll just go in again with a brush, just with Rhinox Hide again, and just add some small little spots of chipping around the edges. Now it's time to pick out some heraldry for this knight. So I don't know anything about knight lore, knight houses, knight anything. I just know I have a ton of transfers. So I took some transfers from Imperial Guard vehicles, some from knight transfer sheets that I've had from previous projects, some from some military vehicles, and some other just completely ancillary projects that have nothing to do with Warhammer. Some custody stuff, and I just picked out things that I look cool. I'm a big proponent of rule of cool. Most of my stuff doesn't conform to anything really. I just kind of slap on what I think looks neat, and I guess if I need to justify it later, I can always just make something up. I picked two opposing Aquillas for one of the shoulders. I thought the black against the white and then the white against the green would be a nice little effect. And I took some eagles from the Custodes transfers, but I cut away the little lightning bolts just to kind of separate it a little bit from that Custode aesthetic. This got some interest on Instagram, but this is how I do my transfers. I kind of just lay them out on a table and yeah, chaotic desk watering. I'll let them sit for about a minute, and then after gloss varnishing the model previously, I will layer on some Microsol. So this is a solvent that once you put the transfer on, it will soften the transfer a little bit, allow you to conform the transfer more to whatever shape you're attempting to try, and then stick it on. So this is the first of two steps. The next step is micro set. So again, once the sole is on, you'll probably have some bubbles in it. It may not conform completely to rounded shapes. Space Marine shoulder pads are a prominently difficult surface for me particularly. So I paint this over once letting that first layer dry, and then after that's sat for about a minute or two, I'll just use a Q-tip and with my finger roll it along the surface, and you'll see this will flatten out any bubbles and really make it stick to the shape. I've then sprayed over the transfer again with a gloss varnish, and now using AK Interactive Streaking Grime, I thinned it down heavily with some product that I actually generally use for oils, but it works the same. It's the Fast Dry Thinner from Abtelung 502. I'm now going over it again with a brush loaded with that same Fast Dry Thinner. It kind of reactivates the streak and grime, and I can pull most of it off, but it leaves, obviously, streaks, but it leaves it in the recesses. It kind of blends it out from the recesses, and it just gives it a really nice, dirty, worn, weathered feeling. I'll then moisten a makeup sponge with that same thinner, and I'll go over the highest raised surfaces. So you can see this really cleans them off. It allows me to feather out the streak and grime a bit and create a bit of a nicer blend. One of the issues I have with streak and grime is generally I see people slap it all over a model and just kind of go with that. I think it can be a bit much. I like to be somewhat more subtle with it. So you can see, for the most part, the higher surfaces are pretty much completely clean again, but as you go further into those edges, it gets dirtier and dirtier, which I just think looks really good. I'm now just being a little bit extra. I'm using some brown oil paint and just dabbing it into some of the bigger chips. And then with a brush that's slightly dampened, again with that same Abtelung 2 Fast Dry Thinner, I'm running it vertically through the paint and creating like a little streak. Then using a sponge and yet more Rhinox Hide, I'm going over the transfers just to blend them in, make them look weathered as well, and more a part of the armor panel itself rather than just slapped over the top. I'll then take the highlight color of whatever armor panel I'm doing and add some chips as well. I think this creates a really nice effect. So obviously not all of the chips in the transfer that are, you know, theoretically painted onto the armor panel are going straight through the armor panel. Some of them are just weathering that paint off. I guess you could call it highlighting, but I'm taking a very purposefully ruined brush and kind of just stippling on like chipped looking highlights over the armor panel. I think for a model that's this heavily weathered and grimed, for there to be completely smooth lines of highlights, it would just look a little bit strange. So this is a technique that I like to employ fairly regularly these days to kind of illustrate light catching off uneven surfaces and just weathered armor panels. It's now time for my least favorite part of painting any knight, especially these Cerastus knights, and that's the trim. I'm using scale color Decayed metal as a base coat for a kind of ruined burnished gold. I'm then going over it with black Templar contrast paint. I do remember that that first panel, I didn't actually like how it turned out. So I thinned it down quite a bit with contrast medium. I think 3 parts contrast medium and 1 part contrast paint. And then I went back into the edges of the armor to create a bit of a blend, painted on some contrast, and then feathered it out a bit. I'm now using Scale 75's Despair Green, very heavily watered down, and just kind of putting it around some of the rivets and just kind of creating a little bit of an oxidized effect. Nothing too in your face, but nice and subtle. Now using a sponge, I'm using some Viking gold from Scale 75 and just picking out the higher edges, you know, the middle sections of trimming, and just creating a nice weathered kind of blended highlight for these armor panels. Again, I think if everything else is weathered, if it were to be too smooth of a blend, it would look a bit strange. Now using one of my favorite colors of all time, this is Velljo Metal Color Exhaust Manifold. I'm base coating all of the metal. I'm now using, again, one of my favorite, and this comes from commission painting for a long time. This was a blend that I kind of just created to save money, but it also looks good on just about everything. It's 1 part airbrush thinner, 1 part Agrax EarthShade, and 1 part Army Painter's black kind of dip wash. I don't know if they make it still because I've had the same big bottle for like 4 years now, but it creates a nice black brown wash that's very cheap to make and will last you absolutely forever. I'm using a soft makeup brush to dry brush some highlights, and I'm using Velljo Model Color Silver. I find using a makeup brush gives not an even, but kind of a nicely blended feathered highlight that picks up all of the edges obviously, but then does deposit a little bit of color onto the flat surfaces and just looks really nice. I'm now going to mix up an oil wash. So this is 1 part burnt umber, 1 part black, from Abtelung 502, and again that same fast dry thinner that I mentioned before. We'll thin that down and mix it up. I can't give you an exact recipe on the amount of thinner I use. When it comes to oil washes, I kind of just ballpark it. Maybe I'll dab one little bit on, and if it's not viscous enough, I'll add some more and just kind of go back and forth. Probably a little bit wasteful, but it is what it is. I'll then go over the majority of the model and just let that oil wash run into the recesses. This will add a little bit more of a dirty, grimy, greasy look to all of the metal panels for virtually no effort. Just like the streak and grime, I will moisten a makeup sponge with some of that thinner and just wipe the oil away from the higher raised edges and allow it to just kind of blend into the recesses there. It's now time to paint some more fun stuff. So I'm base coating the sword with black. And this is in preparation for a nice cool kind of fluoro glowing effect that I was going for. I'll then use white ink because it's nice and opaque while also being relatively viscous and easy to use, and put it into some of these cables. I'll then use an airbrush and just blend with white ink back and forth and create some kind of highlighted blends in preparation for fluoro paint to go over the top. Just using the angle of the actual sword itself to kind of block one half while spraying the other. It's quite easy and quick to just create that nice back and forth, glowing power sword effect that everyone seems to love. I also decided to base coat the inner parts of these little vents with a brush and some white ink, and then just add some kind of halo effect glow with an airbrush as well. Now using Vellejo's Fluro Color Red. I'd never used the red before, but I decided to just wing it and go for it. I just, with many thin passes, because that's kind of just the way you want to do fluoro colors. You don't want to flood the surface and have it run or pool or anything like that. I went over both the black and the white combined. You can see after multiple passes now, this is kind of how we're looking. It's a little bit glossy because it is still a little bit wet, but the effect's really coming together. I think overall this took 5 or 6 different layers. I'll now go in with white again and just add some more aggressive kind of spot highlights toward the center of those brighter parts of the sword. Now using a small brush, I get some black and I just kind of run the edge along these raised ridges of the cables. And that's to create a kind of cooling off effect towards the outer area of the sword and also make the brighter parts more prominent and punchy. I used a brush and added some quick edge highlights to the brighter parts of the glowing sword. Again, using the edge of the brush just to run along the surface. And it's now time for, I keep saying everything's the most satisfying, but I think now this is actually the most satisfying part of this model. Putting on the armor panels. It's really fun to see all of these different panels that you've been painting really come together very quickly and create one cohesive model like this. It's probably one of the more rewarding parts of this process. And yes, I am aware I forgot to paint that top hatch. But with that, it's time for some beauty shots. If you've stuck around this far into the video, I want to say thank you. Hopefully you've gotten something useful out of it. Again, if you want a chance at owning this very miniature yourself, please go check out the link in the description for my Patreon. Support me there. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.